Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon on our webinar about building high integrity assessments with InnerOrbit. So my name is Emily Miller, and prior to coming to InnerOrbit, I was actually a high school chemistry teacher for 10 years here in Minnesota. And during that time, I taught in our alternative learning program. I taught regular chem, honors chem, so lots of different ways to teach a lot of different kids. I worked a lot with the NGSS in my time in the classroom. I did a lot of PLC, data-driven dialogue, and now I have the joy of partnering with districts to help them implement InnerOrbit. And my hot take is that just plain old black coffee is the superior morning beverage. Like, don't get me wrong, like I like a fancy coffee, but I need to have like a small cup of just plain black hot coffee first before I can do anything else. And I'll pass it off to Julia.
No, I totally get that. Especially with the sugar, like I feel like first thing in the morning, it's kind of rough. Yeah, but thank you so much, Emily, for introducing yourself. And as for me, my name is Julia. I was a teacher and a tutor for elementary students in the Dominican Republic for a few years. But I've been, now it's 5 years actually. I always forget to change that, but it's 5 years. I've been 5 years working within InnerOrbit and supporting teachers and districts with their NGSS implementation. I've been providing guidance and resources to schools and districts building assessments and transitioning into their NGSS instruction. And I think, Emily, I used to love matcha, but then I became a mom. And now, honestly, matcha just doesn't do it for me anymore. I need coffee. And having a 6-month-old that doesn't sleep through the night is really rough. So coffee is right up my alley. I've been drinking espresso every day. There's a machine downstairs and I go every day to find something. And today we're going to dive into our webinar. We're going to unpack what is NGSS sense making, see how one-dimensional and two-dimensional items support 3D assessment design, and we're going to watch InnerOrbit's assessment tools in action. So first of all, we're going to go on to what sense making is and what it is not. Then we're going to talk a little bit about the foundations of the NGSS and sense making. Emily is going to walk us through some scaffolding towards sense making. We're going to talk about some curriculum alignment that we have on InnerOrbit. Finally, we're going to go over some data reports and we're going to wrap it up. And all of that, we're going to do it in 25 minutes or less, hopefully. We always have these webinars be like 30 minutes or so. But if you're interested in learning more about InnerOrbit, I'm just going to drop this into our chat in case you have to leave early. If you want to try InnerOrbit on your own or get some additional information, this is just an interest form to let us know you want to learn more about it, and then we can reach out later. But just to get started, let's go into what is sense making really. And to do that, we're going to take a look at two different tasks. So on the same content. So on the left, we have this boiling water on a stove. And we're asking students here to draw a model to show how the heat exchange of the stove affects molecular motion and results in the water boiling. Then we also have another task. There's this person throwing boiling water in the snow. And we ask students, how does boiling water make snow? Create a model showing how water and air particles change when hot water is thrown in the very cold air. And now, if you want to drop in the chat a little bit what you think the main difference between these two could be, we would really appreciate that. So I'm going to give you about 30 seconds to write that down if you're interested in participating. I know we have some people here, but what is the main difference that we see between these two tasks? And why is that difference important? Maybe if we want to talk a little bit more about that. Okay, so I said 25 minutes, so I'm going to try to keep that promise. But if you're typing, feel free to keep doing so, and we'll get to these answers later. But just to understand really what separates these two tasks, let's actually look at them more closely. So with this first example about boiling water, we've all seen this on a stove. This is not a new thing. Students have seen this too, and this is a phenomenon they probably talked about many times before. And the task here is asking them to draw that model. But is this fostering any specific type of thinking? They can basically pull from something that they've already memorized or they have drawn before. They don't really need to wrestle with a new idea or anything unexpected here. And this is why we'd call this a representation tasks, because students already know what's happening, water's boiling, they're being asked to represent this process that they've already explained and demonstrated before. So it's structured, predictable, and the goal is mainly to show the steps or the mechanism. There's nothing here new that's going on. Now, comparing that to what was happening on the other tasks, this one is a lot more interesting. So someone is throwing boiling water and it turns into snow. The students here are asked to explain how that happens and create a model to show what's going on with the water particles and the air particles and how they're interacting with each other to create the snow. Now, this is sense making because students aren't just documenting something that they already understand. They're trying to figure out what this puzzling phenomena is. So there's also uncertainty. There's a need to connect ideas, and they have to reason their explanations and use a model for a tool for thinking, not just to show something that happened, but actually understand and explain what's going on right here. Now let's put a name to all of this. We know it's called sense making, right? But this is actually what's happening in their heads when they work through a phenomenon-based lesson. So it happens when students take ideas, abilities, and experiences that they've already have and connect them to a new phenomenon or problem in 3 specific ways that we are listing here. So they address the uncertainty that the phenomenon is presenting. There's something puzzling that doesn't necessarily make sense immediately. Second, they figure out why it's happening. They just don't, it's not just describing what's going on, but they explain the mechanism that's going on here. And third, they also need to propose solutions themselves, ask probing questions that push that thinking forward. And now looking at this diagram, this is really a great visual version of how the 3 dimensions that come together. These are the SCPs, DCIs, and cross-cutting concept that we're going to get to in a second. But it's all pulling toward different dimensions. But when they actually connect all those dimensions to the phenomena or problem is when we actually understand that sense-making is happening. Now, there's 4 criteria that we can use for specific phenomena that we come across, right? How do we even know that the phenomena that we're using is one that we could use in the classroom? So first, we need to understand if the phenomena is central. So it has to actually connect to the core content that we're trying to teach, not just be a hook, but actually something that's critical and crucial to understand this standard, that we have to use the standard to understand it. It also needs to be compelling. So students need to genuinely want to figure it out. So why? Boiling water is hot, snow is cold. How is this going on? So it needs to spark that curiosity in order to drive sense making. Also, it needs to be relevant. So it should connect to students' lives or experiences in some way because they need to have a reason to care, right? And finally, specific, because it should be broad. It shouldn't be so broad or vague that there's no clear entry point for investigation. So this is the bar that we're putting here so that every phenomenon in our unit should be measured against before we actually build a lesson around it. And now the part that we really want to focus on is how these 3 things come together, as we were saying, to actually get to sense making. So this is a screenshot of a performance expectation, right? So it's asking students to construct an argument from evidence that in a particular habitat, some organisms can survive well, some survive less well, and some cannot survive at all. So what are we putting here together? First, we have the DCI. In this case, we're talking about adaptation. We also have the science and engineering practice. Yeah, that we see that highlighted in orange right here. We also have the science and engineering practice that in this case, it's engaging in argument from evidence. That's what students are being asked to do. And then finally, we have the cross-cutting concept. In this case, which is how students think. So in this case, we have, so can you actually show that some organisms survive well, some survive less well, and some cannot survive at all. So this is all cause and effect. So at this point, what we want to understand is that when students demonstrate mastery of these standards is when they can do all these things together. If they can do them in isolation, that's great, but it doesn't necessarily mean that they're engaging in that sense-making process. So mastery is only demonstrated when a student can meet the performance, when they can actually construct an argument from evidence, as we're saying here, about using what they learned about adaptation and applying it through the lens of cause and effect. And this is the whole performance, the whole point of performance expectations being written this way because they're not a checklist of 3 things that we need to cover. They actually need to come together in order to integrate that performance and for students to meet the PE. And now Emily's going to walk us through building assessments.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Julia. So now that we've got an understanding of what sense making is and what's required for students to do sense making, so novel phenomena and the incorporating of those 3 dimensions, we're going to start talking about how you can actually build a high integrity assessment to ensure that students are in fact sense making. But before we get there, let's just quick talk about how it's kind of a big shift to have students go from representation to sense making. So in order to incorporate all 3 dimensions and make sense of a novel phenomena, that is a rigorous performance that we're asking students to try to do to demonstrate their mastery. And I don't know about y'all, but in my time in the chemistry classroom, I use that pot of boiling water on the stove so many times. And it is important. It is like a nice, like foundational, concrete example to give them. It's something that you can kind of model thinking around. But to try to go from there all the way to sense making can be a really big jump, which is why here at InnerOrbit, we've done our best to try to have assessment items written to help scaffold students to 3 dimensional sense making. So rather than just kind of throwing them in the deep end and hoping that they swim, we've got certain types of questions that slowly build up to that 3 dimensional rigor and allow you to collect really detailed data along the way to see where you can give them targeted support to actually help them achieve that 3 dimensional sense making. So what I want to do here is I want to show you an example of some of our different question types that lead to this 3 dimensional scaffolding. And then I actually want to jump into InnerOrbit for a little bit and show you what it actually looks like on the site as well. So in order to help students with sense making, all of the questions on our site are tied to a novel phenomena. Like this one, why don't all C-star offspring look the same? So once students are engaged with this phenomena, you as an educator have a bank of questions that you can pick and pull from to build your assessment. And these questions come in a few different varieties. The first question that you could pick is a 1-dimensional core content question. These are DCI purely content questions. Now, we obviously want to move away from representation and away from DCI only, but at the same time, we do need to make sure that they understand those like core concepts before we start building more to it, which is where our 2-dimensional questions start to come in. Our 2-dimensional questions still have the DCI component, but they then either layer the cross-cutting concept or the SEP. So what's nice with these questions is students can practice these different skills and thought processes in isolation before we merge them together in a 3-dimensional question. And then they also give you valuable insights to see which dimensions students may need more support with before you eventually give them a 3-dimensional sense-making question, which is what we want them to be able to do at the end of the day in order to demonstrate that mastery. So I'm going to give you a little bit of a deeper dive on what these questions actually look like. So here I have an example of that 1-dimensional core content question. So this question is all about the key differences between sexual and asexual reproduction. Notice that this question really doesn't reference the starfish too much. They don't need to necessarily do anything with the information or connect thinking. This is just straight up, do you know the differences between these 2 different types of reproduction? And this is important because if students don't understand these basics, we can't ask them to demonstrate their understanding by doing a skill if they don't have that initial understanding. So that's where those 1-dimensional questions come in. Then, once students have a grasp of the understanding, that's where you can start scaffolding in the other dimensions. So now I've got an example here of our 2-dimensional cross-cutting concept question. So which of the following processes increase genetic variation in sea stars? So this cross-cutting concept here is cause and effect. So as you can see, students need to think about what causes genetic variation in sea stars. So they first need to understand what genetic variation is and what it's tied to, DNA. So that's that content portion. But now they need to think about it in a new way and think about how these connect and relate to each other through cause and effect. So this can give you that insight if they can take their knowledge and then think about it in a new way. Then we also have our 2-dimensional content and practices questions. Now this still has that DCI, but now it's layering in the SEP. So this question is having students refer to a model in figure 1. The picture is like a starfish that's splitting in half and turning into 2 new starfish. And it's asking how the DNA would compare to the original. So in this case, we're still having that knowledge, this understanding of DNA and reproduction, sexual versus asexual, but now they need to apply that with a model. So they need to look at a model, interpret a model, and then they need to demonstrate their understanding of the growth and development of organisms using that model. So all of those questions are scaffolds. Do they understand? Can they layer in the dimensions? And then finally, on our site, we do have the option of these three-dimensional sense-making questions, which is where we want our students to end up at the end of the day. So this question here is multiple choice, and it has them thinking about how they would make a model to help explain to a friend this idea of the growth of organisms and thinking about that cause and effect mechanism behind the growth of those organisms. And we even have the ability to take this a step farther too. We also on our site have the ability for students to do free and constructed response questions as well. While multiple choice questions are great, there is some inherent scaffolding in there because students can do process of elimination or narrow down to the best choices. But with free response, they really need to be able to explain their thinking and demonstrate their knowledge on their own. So they have the ability to do that as well. And so with this scaffolding, you can help students reach that three-dimensional sense making. And then you can use these questions and these tools to build those high integrity 3D assessments. So going from that core content one-dimensional, then going to the two-dimensional, and then going to the three-dimensional can be a way to help get them there. And this is where I want to take just a couple of minutes to show you a little bit about what the InnerOrbit platform actually looks like on the inside. And then Julia will talk a little bit about our data and reports, and we'll call it a day. So when you go into InnerOrbit, the first place that you're brought to is our build page. And this is where you can navigate to find different phenomena and different questions. There, you can search by keyword or phrase. So for example, you could type in like photosynthesis and find things tied to photosynthesis, or you can use our tiles down here. I personally like the tile view. So for example, you could click greater course, you could click high school, you could click chemistry, and then from there, you've got those main domains. So HSPS1, HSPS2, HSPS3, these are from the NGSS directly. So if we want to look at matter, for example, we could click HSPS1, and now you have all the HSPS1 NGSS standards. So let's say you want to start building an assessment around HSPS 11. You can go ahead and click on that standard, and that's where you're going to see what's available to you. So we have pre-made assessments, which we'll talk a little bit more about here in a bit, but then down here is your entire item bank. So we have 4 different phenomena clusters. This one has 17 questions, this one has 20, for a total of 79 questions on just that one standard HSPS 11. So you have so many different ways that you can utilize this bank. You can have a formative, you can do in-class practice, you could have a summative, you could have a retake, because there's so many different clusters and so many different questions within them. Once you actually go ahead and click into a phenomena, this would be the phenomena that students would need to read and reference in order to answer the questions. And then down here is that item bank that I was mentioning previously. Another type of question that we have that I didn't mention earlier is we actually do have prior knowledge questions. So these are questions that are one-dimensional, but they actually reference an earlier grade level band. So in this case, middle school. We then have our one-dimensional core content questions. So these are high school level content questions. We have those two-dimensional CCC questions. We have those two-dimensional SEP questions. And then we have those three-dimensional questions at the bottom, with a mixture of free response and multiple choice. As you can see, the free response does come with a rubric to help you grade these as well. Otherwise, everything else on our site is auto-graded. So by going to the build page and then clicking through these tiles, you can see all of the different types of clusters and question types that we have for all the different NGSS standards to then build that high integrity assessment. And at the end here, we will share a way that you can pilot InnerOrbit and try it out for free so you can actually log in and get in there and actually see some of those questions and phenomena yourself. But I'm going to go ahead and pass it off to Julia to start wrapping us up here.
Yes. And thank you, Emily, for walking us through the platform. I want to talk a little bit about curriculum alignment and data. I want to highlight that InnerOrbit has alignment to different curricula, including Amplify, FOSS, Lab Aids, Mystery Science, New Visions, Open Science, PhD Science, and STEM scopes. So the idea here is that all of these alignment guides will guide onto the performance expectations that the units in these curricula already have mastery for. So for example, if I was teaching a sixth grade teacher and I am using Open Syed, these tiles will help me find different types of assessments for that same unit. And now we have 3 different types of assessments, pre-made assessments, that are tied to all of these curricula. The first one is a diagnostic one, only including one-dimensional questions, so prior knowledge and DCI only questions. This is just to uncover if there are any misconceptions with the class that we need to address before moving on. We also have the scaffolded formative assessments. One of my favorites, because when we gather the data, we get to see how students performed in different types of questions, and we get to spot, okay, so maybe this tells me that students are struggling with the SEP on this performance expectation. Maybe it's developing and using models, or maybe it's a cross-cutting concept, but that it will let you understand what specific dimensions students are struggling with or they're exceeding expectations for. And finally, the summative. With the summative, as Emily mentioned, with the 3-dimensional questions, that is our end goal. Our end goal is the students are able to answer those questions without the scaffolding, without help from their teachers or discussions with their peers. At the end of the day, this is what we're aiming for. So for these summative assessments, we're asking, did students reach that mastery after instruction? So maybe a few of these would make an end of unit assessment or benchmark assessment for us to understand where students are at. And that's what they also see, the types of questions that they also see on state tests. And now talking about the data, going specifically on to how it looks on InnerOrbit, we have a dimensions report. We're going to focus on 2 different reports today. We have lots of others, but we're going to focus on 2. And this one is the dimensions report. As you can see, the results are broken down by the dimensions of the NGSS. First, we have the DCIs, then the SEPs and cross-cutting concepts, and you can easily understand, okay, so as a group, students are struggling with this and that, but then filter and understand if there's like additional factors that are affecting your students' performances too. And also, when we go into the SEP, it even shows you down to the element of what each dimension is breaking down. So for example, here we see that students have some room for improvement in developing and using models in grade 3-5, and then we see the element of the SEP that students are either excelling or struggling with. For example, they're doing really well in planning and carrying out investigations right here. So these are the things that we want to see and understand. And this will also give not only the teachers additional information to understand which strategies are working best in their classroom, but also as leaders, we get to understand, okay, so what are some successful strategies that have been used in different school sites that we could maybe replicate? And this also is a very, very helpful report to see it in, like this one. In this case, we see that in developing and using models, there's definitely something going on in school number 4. A lot of our schools are struggling with this specific SEP at the middle school level, but maybe there are some teachers that we can talk to and say, hey, what are you guys doing? Is there a specific activity that's going on that you've been implementing in your classroom with modeling so that we can see and replicate these same strategies in other classrooms too? And now that was just the summary of what InnerOrbit is, how to build high integrity assessments with InnerOrbit. And if you're interested, we can definitely talk about a pilot, or we can even give you additional information. If you fill out the interest form that we're going to drop again in the chat, we can always start a conversation with you, with your district, to talk about how a pilot would look like, how InnerOrbit can best fit the needs of your district or even your school, if that's something that you wanted to do. And if you're a teacher and you want to try this on your own, fill out that form too, because there's also a way that you can see the content and understand how you could implement this in your classroom, maybe with some sense making practice and other things. But if you have any questions, Emily and I are going to hang out We did it in 25 minutes. Yay. Emily and I are going to hang out for a little bit, and you can either type your questions in or let us know if there's anything that you want clarification on. But if not, you can always email us at sales@innerorbit.com. Follow our YouTube channel. We always post content there. We have webinars not only just about InnerOrbit, but also about science pedagogy in general and the NGSS. So if there's anything else that we can answer right now, we'll hang out for a minute and then we'll call it a day.